Justin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Can people hear me? Hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize in advance. A lot of the jokes are for my own enjoyment. So if people don't
Excellent.
like
We
them, I'm
love
sorry.
that.
But what we'll do today is we're going to talk about composting. And we have three different sections, like Stephanie had mentioned. The first one is kind of just general backyard composting. The second section is a little bit about kind of my compost operation and business, not trying to be sales pitchy, more just so people can kind of visualize how things happen at a slightly bigger scale. And then finally, we have a section about worm composting, since with COVID, a lot of folks are very interested in composting and managing their waste and things like that. And we've seen a lot of interest in worm composting the last couple of months. So first off, the slides here, since in case someone listening is a former or current English or science teacher, I just need to cite my sources. This is a slide deck that I sourced from Maryland Master Gardeners years ago, and they ripped it off from Penn State. So I just want to give a shout out to Maryland Cooperative and Penn State, who actually got ripped off the first time around. So what we'll do is we'll go through the slide deck, and hopefully I'll try to speak clearly, and hopefully we'll cover all the questions people have. Just real quick about kind of our operation. We turned 10 years old last week. So I've been a commercial composter for 10 years. I did not grow up on a farm. I don't have any family in the waste industry. I grew up in Columbia and went to Wild Lake High School. So I lived walking distance from the Columbia Mall. So my experience with composting prior to this was just like a lot of people, your backyard. But we've grown the business over the last 10 years. What we do is we collect and compost food scraps in Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia. We have a compost facility in Aberdeen that's open on weekdays. You're always welcome to come by and check it out. We also have a small facility down in Virginia. Our process takes roughly 3 to 5 months, so it's a lot faster than the backyard process. And we also do large-scale worm composting, and all of our employees are either veterans or family members of veterans. That's kind of our goal for staffing, is trying to give folks purposeful employment. So when we talk about composting, I think it's important to keep in mind that compost happens. And we'll talk about that, and this slide will reappear a couple of times, because as we start to get borderline technical or specific, at the end of the day, it's all going to break down, right? And we'll talk about in a second about decomposition, but it's happening every day all around us. All we're trying to do is just optimize the process. So, we'll talk about carbon to nitrogen ratios and things like that later. There's no need to get too wrapped around the axle, because it's kind of an art and a science, right? There's a lot of shrugging and rules of thumb in compost of, it looks pretty good, or, looks all right. So that's kind of how most of the industry, even at the larger scale, goes. So as we go along, just remember, no matter what you do, compost is going to happen. So what is composting? So like I said, there's natural decay that's going on around the clock every day for as long as the planet's been here, pretty much. All organic matter is breaking down, whether you walk through the forest and kick over leaves and see the decomposition in the leaf matter. You see trees and things like that with visible decomposers on it, like mushrooms and things like that, or bugs. And then there's the majority of the work's being done by invisible creatures, fungi, bacteria, things like that. But all it's doing is, when we're doing composting, is we're trying to optimize decay to try to happen a little bit faster and produce a product that has some of the properties that we want. And we'll talk about in a minute the different ingredients, but shown here are typical things you'd see around the house: grass clippings, food scraps, leaves. Side note on grass clippings, I prefer to use a mulching lawnmower, but if you do collect and bag your grass clippings, we can certainly talk about how to compost those. So when we look at composting, there's just a couple factors to keep in mind for things to manage. Air, oxygen is one of the most important things. We want to have an aerobic process, not an anaerobic process. So all the issues when we talk about later troubleshooting, almost all of them have to do with moisture, because you get odors and poor decomposition when you don't have good airflow. So as long as there's oxygen and that pile can breathe, we're on the way to success. The second most important thing is moisture content. And we'll talk later about what roughly we should be at for moisture content and how to measure that in your backyard. But a lot of times, a lot of people's challenges when they're having issues with their pile, once again, with odors or things happening or not happening, water and moisture content's usually the second most important thing to look at. Then we have food, as in the ingredients we're going to use. And then finally, temperature. And I put a little asterisk mark on temperature when I think about it, because odds are in your backyard, you're probably not going to have a hot pile. So here at our facilities, we're at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and we can break down just about anything. But in the backyard, it's different because we don't have as much material, and things are just going to take longer at lower temperatures, but that's fine. You're still going to end up making really good compost. So if we manage these different factors, we can speed up the process, and we can help to optimize the process, make sure that there's not, unwanted pests, odors, things like that. So let's just talk real quick about why we should compost in the first place. We'll talk about benefits later on as well, but some statistics that are kind of crazy is that the average American, there's a pound of food waste per day. And 30% of all the food that's created in the US is wasted. And that's generally a number that's worldwide. And that's not necessarily just in our refrigerator. It's all along the process, things that never make it out of the farm field, things that are lost in production and transportation and distribution. And there's whole week-long conferences dedicated to how to better allocate food in this country. If we took all the food in this country that was wasted, we could easily feed all the people that are going hungry. And there are certainly efforts underway to do that. One other thing that makes composting interesting is that we got a topsoil problem in this country, and it's not something that's often talked about because it's slowly happening. But one day, the corn just ain't going to come up because we're going to be out of topsoil in this country. So we lose roughly 1% of our topsoil in the U.S. each year, and that's 10 times faster than nature can replace it. It takes 500 years on average to make an inch of topsoil. So topsoil depletion is pretty sad, and I'm sure you've seen those videos or the satellite photos when they open the Conowingo Dam after big storm events and that big plume of sediment comes into the Chesapeake Bay. That's all rich, great topsoil that's washing down the Susquehanna Valley that's gone for forever. So, there is an issue with, composting helps to solve that issue of fertile soil being lost. One thing that's interesting too, if food waste was a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. So it goes China, US, food waste. It says food wastage here because I think that was made by a non-American person. It's courtesy of the FAO, which I hope we're still a member of. I know we're rapidly leaving UN committees, but the amount of food waste worldwide is a big issue because we use a lot of energy and fossil fuels and water and things like that to produce food that ultimately is never consumed. So the benefits of composting, this is a cool little slide, a little smart sheet that's from the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition. Just kind of talks about all the great properties of compost. And I know a lot of folks listening are probably already fans of compost. You know a lot of these things about water retention, stopping erosion. One thing that's gathering more attention is carbon sequestration. So when you take compost, you take organic matter and keep it out of the landfill and turn it into compost, and then put that compost into your soil, you're helping to sequester carbon. And so there's projects afoot, places like Marin County, California, where they're applying compost to grazing areas and seeing dramatic increases in carbon sequestration. And there's all kinds of studies. If you want to go down a rabbit hole of research on the internet and Google, there's all kinds of stuff out there right now about all the ways we could help with global warming just by taking compost, making it, and putting it on our soil. We could do dramatic changes in CO2 sequestration. And then finally, helps keep our landfills from filling up, and then reduces the need for synthetic fertilizers. So things like compost tea are gaining strength in areas of lawn care and things like that, and replacing synthetic fertilizers, which is, good news for things like the Chesapeake Bay. So what do we need to make compost? Now that we've all agreed that compost is great, let's make some of the stuff. So what do we need? We need decomposers, and those are the things that are going to make the compost happen. Now, there are the visible things like worms and pill bugs and mushrooms and things like that, but generally the decomposers that are going to do the heavy lifting are the ones we can't see. Those are bacteria and fungi. And we need food for those decomposers. So we'll talk about browns and greens, the two different things we want to feed them. And then, like we talked about earlier, we need that air and that moisture to help make those microbes happy and make them productive. So where do the decomposers come from? They're all around us, and everyone loves to quote Field of Dreams, and it's definitely true. If you build the compost pile, the microbes are going to be there. So they're riding along on a lot of that material, and you don't need to worry necessarily about inoculating them. Amazing statistics out there. If you want to look at the soil food web or look at the research by people like Dr. Elaine Ingham or David Johnson about all the microbes that are in compost, there's just amazing amounts of stuff in there, the fungal threads, the bacteria, things like that that are in there. And it's really one of the main selling points on compost is all that microbial life. So like I said, if you build it, they will come. There are a lot of compost starters on the market at places like Home Depot. You don't need them. They're generally a waste of money. A lot of times what they are, is typically high nitrogen fertilizer. You put it in your compost pile, your pile gets really hot and you say, wow, it must be working. Well, that's working because there's just it's kind of like spraying ether in your motor. It's that shot of nitrogen that just makes your pile temperature spike. They also claim to have microbes in there, but there's no third party that's checking that. So who's to say, if those microbes are truly in there? So I would say save your money. There's really no need for a compost starter. If you wanted to do something to kind of get the pile going, you could add in some old compost from your last batch of compost. Or if there's a particular area of your yard that does well, you could take some of that soil and add it to your compost pile, and that'll help to inoculate your pile with some microbes. So if you want to do something to get it going, you can. And I would suggest either using some old compost from a previous batch or using a couple shovelfuls of soil from an area of your property that you think does well. And like I mentioned, Dr. Elaine Ingham, she actually goes out in the forest and finds patches of forest soil and adds them to her compost piles, trying to get that fungus in there that she wants, those different fungal colonies. So no need to spend the money at Home Depot. If you feel the urge to spend $12 on that, just, go repurpose it into some Gatorade or something that's appropriate for hot weather this time of year. So we're going to talk about the best food, and we're also going to talk about the things to avoid. So the things pictured here are all things that we have probably around our homes and probably things that homeowners are looking to deal with when they ask you questions about composting. There's also other things out there. You can compost your used potting soil, throw that back in the mix to, break it down. You can do manure. We'll talk about some of the challenges with manure, sawdust as well. And then finally, hair is listed here. I don't think that I put that in there. I think that was someone else put that on the slide. You can do hair. It's a little creepy, in my opinion. And, people might be a little bit sketched out when they look around your garden and see tufts of hair potentially popping out of your garden. So just, be prepared of the spookiness of maybe having hair mixed into your compost. We talked about materials to avoid. So there's a couple of things that are just going to be more trouble than they're worth. And so oils, fats, grease, meat, things like that, they just attract a lot of pests, raccoons, flies. They would break down, yes, but the vectors that they're going to bring to your yard, mice, things like that, it's just not necessarily worth the trouble. So I would suggest skipping that. Unwashed eggshells, you could probably include eggshells. That one, I'd live a little and throw those in there. Hard to kill weeds. This is a thing that people often do. They throw their weeds in their compost bin, and then all that does is create a really rich bed of material for the weeds to then germinate and grow in. So if you have invasives or hard to kill weeds, things like that, those need to go out for trash. So those need to be disposed of. Like I went on a war against multiflora rose in my yard over the winter and sent it all out for disposal because it's just too much trouble to be composted. Cat and dog waste, I would recommend disposing of that. Yes, there are options to do it, and there are systems that are out there. I have a cat, and I put it out at the curb, and that's, someday when we get all the food waste and manure and wood waste in the country composted, I'm willing to tackle cat and dog waste and diapers for children. But in the meantime, I'd prefer to just let that go. So the issues with animals that eat meat or an omnivore diet is there are risks of zoological pathogens. So animals that are herbivores, we don't necessarily have those issues. So things like cows, chickens, things like that. But for household pets and other animals, there's too many pathogen risks there. So it's at a lot of zoos, for example, they will separate the manure from the large herbivores from the carnivores. So a lot of zoos that do their own composting of manure will take the elephant and the giraffe poop and compost that, but everything from the lions and the other, meat eaters or omnivores, that goes out for disposal. So I just do that as a pathogen check. And then finally, same thing with the weeds. Our diseased ridden plants. Once again, if we put that into the compost, we're potentially reintroducing all of those disease into our compost and then spreading it all over our garden. So I would, once again, designate those for disposal. Lime and wood ash. People sometimes like to add those to their compost pile, and it just throws off the pH. So I would recommend not adding those to the compost pile. If you have a soil test and you want to apply them to your lawn or garden, I would just do that directly. I'd keep them out of the compost pile. A good finished compost should be neutral. So that's a good way to tell that our compost is finished or close, is it should be just about neutral. And then after we're done the composting process, if you want to amend it, that's when I would suggest monkeying around with the pH. But in the compost process itself, I would avoid lime and wood ash. Let's get to neutral when we finish our process of composting, and then we could amend the garden soil if we're trying to get to a certain pH for certain plants. And then finally, the thing that's thrown in here on some compost slides is avoiding large amounts of black walnut. It's juglone, I think, is the compound there that supposedly kills other plants. I've never seen that break out. You'd have to pretty much compost exclusively black walnut leaves and husks, I think, to accomplish that. But, we'll throw that in there just to be safe. So is shredding necessary? I think if you got a shredder, go for it. If you don't have one, I can think of other things to do on my Saturday. So, it is nice when you have a leaf shredder because it helps to create smaller particles with more surface area. So that helps the microbes attack it and break it down faster. The downside is it creates a smaller particle that's going to pack down. So kind of is the trade-off of the labor and the fuel usage and owning a piece of equipment worth the benefits in composting? I'd say not necessarily. So if you have a leaf shredder, awesome. But I wouldn't go out and necessarily buy one if it was me. So like we said, smaller particles can be problematic, which we'll talk about later. So our compost wants to have two different ingredients, essentially, to get to where it needs to be. It needs things that are rich in carbon, which we call browns, and things that are rich in nitrogen, we call greens. And if you think about things in those two categories, then it makes everything pretty easy. Cornell University has a great composting website. You can go on, and they have very simple information sheets for school groups and home composting. And then they also get very, very technical. They have all kinds of scientific calculations about carbon to nitrogen ratio, about how to measure different feedstocks and how to get there. But at the end of the day, if you did all that math, you'd find out that a good rule of thumb, like the bottom bullet point here, is 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 carbon to nitrogen is usually where you want to be at. So if you have wood chips or sawdust or leaves or shredded newspaper, 2 times that as much food scraps, you're going to hit the ball out of the park. So we'll talk about different carbon to nitrogen ratios, but if you keep that 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 in mind, then you're going to have success. So browns are high carbon materials. So leaves, straw, sawdust, animal bedding mixed with manure. So if you've ever been to a horse farm here in the great state of Maryland, people treat their horses better than they treat their children. And so a lot of people clean out the stalls every day and they put new bedding in. And so most manure piles nowadays in the state of Maryland, you're kind of trying to find the manure. So like I went to Laurel Racetrack a couple months ago to look at a project with them. And the dumpsters are almost all bedding and very sparse on the manure. So if your manure has mostly bedding, then you can consider it a brown. So these are the guys that are going to cause us potential trouble because they tend to have a lot of moisture and a lot of nitrogen. So things like vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, grass clippings, and then the manure itself. So poultry manure is probably the highest for causing trouble because the carbon and nitrogen is so low. So that's why when you walk into a chicken house on the Eastern Shore, it'll help clear up your sinuses with that heavy ammonia smell. If you ever find yourself short on greens, a good source for coffee grounds is you can go to just about any Starbucks on the planet and they will give you coffee grounds for free. And, while coffee is acidic before it's brewed or while you drink it, the actual grounds themselves after the water brews through it are a lot less acidic. And they're nice granule particles. They spread out really nice in a compost pile. They have a good amount of nutrients in them, and generally they don't cause a lot of odor issues. So I love coffee grounds. We'll talk later about some of our customers, but we get in thousands of pounds of Wawa coffee grounds each week. So coffee grounds are an awesome feedstock to compost. So side by side, here's the two different ingredients, and this is kind of the different pros and cons of them. So the high carbon materials, they take longer to break down. If you think about a pile of wood chips, some mulch, leaves, sawdust, they break down, but it takes a while versus your grass clippings in a pile. That pile shrinks pretty quick in the summertime, and they break down really quickly. So we want to bring those two things together because in order to break down carbon, we need nitrogen, and those green materials, they need the carbon because they need somewhere to park that moisture and make sure that there's enough porosity and aeration so that we have good airflow. After all that's being said, right, I said when we start going down a rabbit hole and getting too technical, compost happens. So if we just remember that 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 browns to greens in our compost pile, all those other numbers that we had for carbon and nitrogen, you don't have to worry about the math unless you really like doing math. So aerobic composting, that's what we're going for. We want to make sure there is that air there. It's the fastest way to break things down. So in our system, which I'll show later, we actually force air into the piles. But if we're in our backyard, we want to create a pile that allows for just passive airflow so that things break down quickly without any odors. And if we have enough material, potentially we have some heat. So a hot pile, in terms of how that's thought of for breaking things down, is 55 degrees Celsius or 131 degrees Fahrenheit. That is what's considered in the compost industry PFRP, or process for reduction of pathogens. So that's the temperature where if there was salmonella or E. coli on any of your stuff, it would break down. So at a commercial level, that's really important to make sure that the product is fully decomposed. In the backyard, we may only see a very small movement if we had a thermometer. And a lot of times this time of year, that's due to grass clippings and things being in the pile that kind of make the pile spike a little bit. But even at very low temperatures, like you see here, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, composting is going to happen. A thermometer is really nice. You can find really nice ones on Amazon. The brand we use is Rio Temp. I'm not sponsored by them, and they hold up really well. They're nice little thermometers, but you can find really cheap ones at places like Granger and Harbor Freight and stuff like that too, just if you want to pop a look and see what's going on for your different piles. Usually what happens at a pile when you first build it, if there is going to be a temperature, it'll spike, and that hot temperature comes from all your bacterial decomposition. Bacteria usually kicks things off. Bacteria is like a 6-year-old kid. They just love sugar. So they get in there and they go after your food scraps and your grasses, all those high nitrogen materials, and they get really excited to give off heat and break those high nitrogen materials down. And then as the pile cools down and the high sugar content materials dissipate, the fungal activity usually comes on. And that's what you see on all that woody material. It's the fungus that shows up at lower temperatures, and it's really interested in your more kind of leaves and things like that. So do we have to get hot? Like I said, if it happens, awesome. But if it doesn't, that's fine. It's still going to make great compost. So it'll just take a little bit longer. Typically for getting a hot pile, you need to have at least a cubic yard of material. So a cubic yard, 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, or 200 gallons of material. Now, if you have, a 3-acre yard in Jarrettsville, you probably got some material to make that happen. But if you're on a much smaller, yard in, Ellicott City or Towson or something like that, maybe you just don't have that much material to make that happen. So you can go the Mike McGrath method where you drive around in the fall and steal leaves from your neighbors. I used to do that when I lived in a townhouse in Philly. I used to have people I lived in a row home, and I just had my compost pile at the edge of my fence, and anybody in the neighborhood could come dump their grass clippings in my compost bin. So I was kind of figured I was helping everybody keep it out of the landfill, and then I was getting all the grass clippings for the neighborhood and making a bunch of compost. So air is the most important thing, like we talked about on our 3 things to really think about: air, moisture, and ingredients or food. So we want to have generally passive airflow. So the bin that's shown here is awesome. These are very similar to the bins that are given away in a lot of Maryland counties. Like I don't know if they still do it, but like Howard County, Anne Arundel County used to give away plastic mesh bins, very similar looking to this, where you have airflow from around the sides that's able to penetrate the pile. And then in this case, the person put it on a pallet. So you're getting passive air from below as well. And so the air is able to get in there. And if microbes can breathe, then they can live and they can keep breaking things down. Other opportunities for aeration, for passive aeration, is putting in stacks. So like you can see here, perforated drain pipe in the middle of this picture. People use corn cobs. People in some permaculture things will just dig a hole with a post hole digger and just leave like a hole in the middle of the stack and things like that. So all those things help to passively aerate the pile. This is where the browns are important. If you think about like the wood chips that tree companies use, and those big wood chips that are like 1 inch or 2 by 1 inch or 2, and how bulky those are compared to sawdust. And so by having those bulky materials, it helps to create little spaces in the pile for air to flow between it. If we were to have nothing but sheets of newspaper and food scraps, we'd have no airflow and everything would pack down, and that's when we would get into trouble. So trying to mix up your materials and keep them a little bit fluffy, your leaves, your wood chips, your things like that, that helps to create that. Now, if it does get too dense or we feel like we've lost our porosity, then we can turn the pile to help reestablish that. So this is where it's great in COVID. If you have neighborhood kids around with nothing to do, you can help keep them entertained by flipping compost piles. So the gentleman here, it's a great method to take one pile and flip it into the neighboring pile, and just kind of flip everything and give it a good turn. I like to have, like the pile I used to use at my home was just 4 pickets that established the 4 corners and chicken wire around it. And I could pick up the pickets and sink them next to me and then fork my material back into my little bin. So you could pick up, like that gentleman has the ring, you could pick the whole ring up, move it, and fork everything back into it. So after aeration, water is the next most important thing. A lot of times people are one of the 2 extremes. Either the pile is too dry or the pile's way too wet. So if people rake all their leaves into a pile and then they just wonder why nothing ever happens, that leaf pile is probably too dry. Versus the person who has that tumbler in Baltimore City and all they do is keep dumping their food scraps into it and there's no carb and none of that brown material, and they wonder why it's not breaking down. Well, it's because it's a really heavy, wet muck. So we want our moisture content to be at 40 to 60%. And I'm not going to go down the whole explanation of it, but quick explanation of why that's important is the decomposers in our compost, they actually live in the film of moisture that's around each particle of things in your pile. So if your pile's too dry, then there isn't that thin film of moisture around each little particle of things. And so there's nowhere for the microbes to live and work. And if your pile's too wet, then all that pore space, all that porosity where we want the air to flow, if it's too wet, the water is taking up that pore space and the air can't get in our pile and we get that swampy anaerobic smell. So we want to be at 40 to 60%. And there are moisture meters and things you can buy that are very expensive. But we're going to do it on the cheap, like I do a lot of things in life, and we're going to do it for free. So if you were to reach into your compost pile and grab a handful of material and squeeze it, you should be able to squeeze it and have maybe one little drip of water come out the bottom of your bottom pinky finger. Now, if you're to squeeze it and it won't clump, like let's say you squeeze a handful of material and it doesn't even clump in your hand, it's too dry. We need to add some water. And if you grab it and squeeze it and water just runs out as you're squeezing it, we're too wet. So if we're too dry, it's not clumping. We want to add some moisture. The gentleman here, you can see the picture where they're pouring it in with a bucket. It can be sometimes hard to rehydrate a pile That's where it's good to hit it with the hose or sprinkler and just kind of slowly soak it and maybe turn it and soak it and turn it and soak it a couple times to try to work the water in. And if our pile's too wet, then we need to add some carbonous material, some of those brown materials to help soak up some of the moisture. So if our pile was too wet, then let's add some leaves, or let's add some shredded paper or some sawdust or wood chips to try to soak up some of that moisture and reestablish that space for the air to flow. So the picture here is showing a 3-bin system. These are awesome if you're looking for a way to manage, a decent amount of yard waste. There's a million designs. If you put it in Google for 3-bin compost system, all kinds of different articles and YouTube videos and all that stuff. People making them out of pallets, people making them really fancy out of poured concrete. But it's great because the pile on the left is where we're building our pile. And then once it's built, we flip it into the middle where things continue to break down. And then we flip it to the 3rd bin on the right, where by then it's curing and it's ready to go. So it's kind of a nice way to keep moving things through. We talk about curing. So if we can cure it for 4 weeks, that's always preferred. How often should you turn? The downside to turning frequently is you're going to potentially lose some heat and lose some moisture. So 5 to 7 days is probably a sweet spot if you have the time available and you're really motivated to make compost. And you want to be able, that'll help to create more of a homogeneous mix. It'll get the outside stuff in the middle. It's also a great time to add moisture if it's needed. But once again, compost is going to happen. So if you don't have the time and the ability to flip it that often, you're going to be all right. So this is all about kind of talking about temperature stuff. Curing is important. The longer we can let the material sit, the better it's going to be. Because the longer compost sits, the more fungal activity is going to kick on, the more visible decomposers you'll start to see. When that compost pile is sitting there, you'll start to see worms and pill bugs and little decomposers, the visible signs that it's getting more and more mature. So just like the last bullet point here, like a good box of wine, the longer you sit, the better it gets with age. So the eternal question you'll probably hear a lot, or maybe you think it yourself, is when is compost done? It's really tough for people with a compost tumbler because how do you ever stop the process, right? When you got that one tumbler. But when is compost finished? The easiest answer is when it no longer looks like the stuff you started with. So if it doesn't look like food waste anymore, it's probably looking all right. I mean, you can have all kinds of different colors to it. Some people, their material ends up being more brown. Some people are darker color like you see here. You want to have a good smell to it and, using your kind of senses there. And you'll see a lot of volume loss. So as you start to see that pile shrink, the pile shrinks because of loss of moisture. It shrinks because of particle size reduction. So you'll actually see if you start with, 10 yards of stuff, you may only end up with, 3 to 5 yards of finished compost when you're done, depending on the feedstocks you started with. So simple tests for checking your compost. Number one is the bag test. So you put some compost in a plastic bag, seal it for a couple of days, and then you can see if it has any condensation, or you can open it up and smell it and see if it smells really bad. If you're going to do that test, I recommend having a spotter or someone handy in case you open up that bag and it knocks you off your feet. That's a little dangerous. So I usually err on the second test, which is the seed germination test. Let's take some of our compost and let's put some seeds in it and see if plants grow. So we usually use like peas or beans or cucumbers, things that germinate pretty quickly. They're pretty sensitive and they're pretty cheap seeds. And that way we can see how fast do they germinate? Are they coming up and they're looking strong or a little bit scraggly? Is there any discoloration? Things like that. And really, if the proof is in the pudding, if seeds are growing in it and they're doing well, then that's a pretty obvious sign that our compost is done. So I like to see germination test. We also do some laboratory testing. So if anybody ever wants to go that route, I can help people out with some suggestions on labs that we send it out to. And we do that periodically to get more detailed information on micronutrients and things like that. And then we also have an EC meter and a pH probe here at the farm where we test all of our batches in-house to see where our pH is at. Like I said, we're always striving for that neutral or somewhere around there because that's a good way to measure it. And then our EC to see if, it's at a level that's going to be successful for plant growth. So where should we put the compost pile? Some different questions about that. And I mean, I'm sure if you have other roommates or spouses and things like that, they probably get a vote as well. But if all things considered, a shaded area helps to keep the pile from drying out in weather like today. Putting it in a place that makes sense for the way you're going to use your lawn. You don't want to interfere with your way of life. You want to be able to get to it and be able to have room to flip it. Having the water source available is nice. So if we did get to that situation where we need to add some water, knowing that our hose is going to reach is good. You want to have good drainage. Some people stick them in a low spot in the yard because they're not using it for anything else. And then every time it rains, it floods your compost bin or your pile. And then you get that anaerobic smell, at the bottom of your pile. So I would try to stay somewhere that's not the absolute low spot on the yard. Having it near where you're going to use it helps reduce transportation. So a lot of people keep it in the garden. So when it's done, you can throw it right in the beds. The bullet about being a good neighbor, that's up to you. If you want to use compost as a weapon for a neighbor you don't like and want to build the bin right next to their patio on the property line, go for it. But generally I try to keep mine a little tucked away. And then finally, where it's convenient. So if the pile's all the way in the back of your yard, are you going to go out there in December and add any material to it from the kitchen? Maybe not. But if it's a little bit closer to the house, then you can send it out there. Once again, if you have child labor, then you can, give the pail to your son or daughter or grandchild and send them out there. So, I don't take the compost out. I have someone to do that. Different opportunities for bin construction. Like I said, a great place to start. If you're in places like Anne Arundel County or Howard County or some of the other counties here in Maryland, is to see if there are any free bins available. So the county recycling offices in some towns and counties give them away or have them at a very nominal fee, which is great. But here's some different examples of bins you can build. So like we said, the 1 cubic yard is kind of the magic number for getting to that potential size to have heat or a hot pile because you have enough thermal mass. If you get really big, like a 5 foot by 5 foot by 5 foot, like it says here, then you have to just keep an eye on it in case it gets too hot. In that case, if you're getting to a pile that large, you probably, I hope, have a lawn tractor or something involved. But generally, all these different things we're going to look at kind of are focused on aeration, and then also in some cases, animal control and things like that. So the manufactured bins here, like the Earth Machine, I think they still, I believe, have those sales in some of the different counties where you can get them at a discounted fee. Those are nice. And you can also make them yourself where that you take the lid off and add your material in. And as it breaks down, you can open that little door and kind of rake things out. In bins like that, or that green bin in the bottom right-hand corner, the mesh bin, I like to use the lasagna method where I put down a layer of carbonous material, whether it's newspaper or leaves or wood chips. And then I put my food scraps for a couple of days on top of that. And then I put another layer of carbonous material on top of that. And that always keeps the flies off of it. And I get my layers. And then if I eventually turn it, that helps me get a really good mix. The tumbler there, those are really nice. They can be a little pricey. So, looking for them on Facebook or Craigslist, you'd be surprised when people got to move. A lot of times they're not moving with the compost bin. So you can get a real good deal from a real motivated seller. But those are a great solution for areas where people are really worried about pest control, or they're worried about their HOA or their neighbors, and they want to have everything contained to keep it neat and keep pests out. So those are really nice for that. Just beware in the winter because it's up off the ground, the material in the bin tends to freeze. So people will go out to spin their tumbler in December and everything is frozen on one side. So you struggle to turn it, and then everything's frozen on one side. So when it finally turns, it turns really quickly. And I've heard of people getting knocked over by their tumbler. So be forewarned in the wintertime when it may get a little on the frozen side. Another example of the Earth Machine and how it works. Cool little bin for those. And at the top there, you can either leave it off and let the rain get in there, or leave the lid on. You can also build something very similar if you don't have an Earth Machine or you're worried about pests. You can take a trash can, drilling holes in the side and the bottom, and you can bungee cord the lid on top of a Rubbermaid trash can, and that helps create the holes on the top, create airflow, the holes on the bottom, drainage, and then a bungee cord on the lid on top helps to keep out any pests. So that's a good, $20 substitute for this earth machine. So when we talk about troubleshooting compost piles, there's a lot of sensitivity on odors. So like I now live in Pennsylvania, 3 houses down from an Amish farm. So every morning it smells like manure. That's just part of living near farms. But in suburbia, there's no tolerance for odors. So people get really sensitive really quickly. But the good thing is the odor thing is very fixable. It's usually a sign that we need to fix something in the pile. And it's usually an issue that has to do with moisture and airflow. So if we're getting like a rotten odor, it's probably a pile that's gone anaerobic. So we need to turn the pile and mix in some of that brown material to help get things a little bit more fluffy and to help soak up some of that moisture. If we have that ammonia odor, then once again, the solution, turn the pile, add in more carbonous material, and off you go. So you can kind of notice the trend here that often the solution is mixing in carbon and turning the pile to help fix a lot of our issues. So low pile temperature, if you're trying to get a higher pile temperature, you can make the pile bigger. You can check your moisture content to make sure it's where we want to be, that squeeze test of having the drop come out of the bottom of your hand. And you can add in more nitrogen as you turn it, because that nitrogen will help to spike the pile temperatures. Things like coffee grounds or grass clippings will help to really escalate things. And if your pile's too hot, let's say you make a really big pile or you have a lot of material in there like grass clippings that gets it really jamming, then what you can do is kind of break the pile apart or rake it out, flip it, kind of break it apart, and that'll help to vent some of that air out of there to get your pile down. Generally, like in our operation, we don't go above 160 degrees Fahrenheit, because if you think about how you cook your turkey at Christmas or Thanksgiving, you don't want you cook it to like 160 to make sure everything is safe to eat. But if you go above 160 in your compost pile, it's the same thing. You're killing all the microbes. So there's nothing happening at 160 versus if you come down to 140, 130, it's a safe temperature to be at because you're not at risk of any sort of spontaneous combustion. And it also means that, you're going to have microbial life. And while I mentioned spontaneous combustion, this time of year there are articles that pop up and people blame compost piles all the time for house fires and things like that. It is very tricky in a home compost bin to have spontaneous combustion. You have to really be on your game to spontaneously combust and create a fire. Spontaneous combustion has, is a chemical chain reaction typically, where you need to have a really dry pile that's really compact without airflow to really get things going, heading towards this chain reaction that causes spontaneous combustion. So a lot of times people will blame the compost pile, but that's usually just because it's a fuel source. And I think, the majority of the time it's, someone throwing a cigarette butt or something like that. It's not the pile that's done that. Like I said, you'd have to that earth machine, if you could get that to spontaneously combust, like call me. That would be an amazing thing to pull off. It's very difficult to do. So it's really difficult. I just throw that out there on a hot day like today. I'm sure there'll be some article sometime this week where someone in that region will blame the compost bin for a house fire. Pests, like we talked about, putting a bungee cord on the lid of some of those bins. We're using a tumbler. You got to just know what's in your yard, and you got to know what they can and cannot get into. If they're already getting into your trash cans and things like that, then you're probably aware of who the troublemakers are in your yard. Being mindful of what you put in the bin. Early in the slide deck, we talked about keeping out meats and oils and things that can be odorous and cause issues and really draw in the pests. And so that's where I like a trash can with holes drilled in it with a bungee cord on it and things like that. If it's really especially bad and you're in the city or your HOA doesn't allow it, then you could do worm composting. And if we have time, we'll cover that later. You can just take your composting inside and be done with all these furry creatures. So now that we've talked about how to make this stuff, what are the benefits of it? Like we talked about before in the slide that showed all the different great things about composting is, It helps with water holding capacity. So if you have clay soil, it helps break it up. If you have sandy soil, it helps with water retention. It has 40 different trace nutrients in most composts, things that you're not going to find in a bag of fertilizer. It has organic matter. So a lot of times, the motto in the Compost Council is strive for 5. They're trying to get everybody's lawn in America to 5% organic matter. And a lot of the issues come from just a lack of new microbes and a lack of organic matter in your garden and in your lawn. So as we look here, there's also abilities to create tilth, breaking up clay. It helps with drainage. And it also helps to subdue pathogens and things like that. The great thing about compost is it's a living thing. It's all those microbes. We showed the picture of the spoon earlier that talks about all the fungi and all the bacteria that's in there. There is nitrogen and phosphorus in there, but really the sales pitch on compost is that it's a living thing and it's going to bring your soil back to life. And when your soil's a healthy living thing, then that's when your garden and your flowers and your trees and your lawn all do well. And that's something you can't buy in a bag of fertilizer. So like I said here, can't use the F word when we talk about compost. In the state of Maryland, compost is considered a soil amendment. That's how we're registered with the Department of Agriculture. It's not a fertilizer. The nutrients that are in there are slow release. They're not going to wash away. They're in insoluble form. And there's all those little trace nutrients that are in there from all the different things that you broke down, right? All the food scraps you put in there and all the leaves and all that stuff, they're all contributing to all these micronutrients that are then going to show up back in your soil when you apply your compost. So you can use your finished compost, some different examples, soil amendment. So you want to make sure it's finished. You can either rake it out and let the rain and time do its work, or if you have the time and the ability, putting out an inch or two of composting and tilling it into the top 4 to 6 inches of your soil does a dramatic thing. I had to redo my lawn this past year. I core aerated it, and then I raked out a 1/2 inch to 1 inch of compost across the whole lawn and hit the reboot button. I didn't even till it in or anything. I just put that compost down and then put down grass seed and off it went. So if you can till it in, great. But if you can't, even just raking out the compost will lead to good results. You can use it as a surface mulch. So, here it shows how far to go out on the drip line of a tree. There are some concerns depending on where you buy your mulch with the materials that are used to dye mulch. So if you're trying to get away from that, I'm going to little known secret, there's no redwood trees in the state of Maryland. So if you're buying that red mulch, that's latex paint. So that's how they get that beautiful red color. So if you're trying to go a little more all natural, compost can be a good surface mulch for that. Top dressing lawns, once we get more into the fall, a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch of top dressing does an awesome job for top dressing that lawn. So you want to probably, what I do is I spread it out and then I use a leaf rake to kind of work it in between my grass. So quick story is I'll core aerate my lawn. I'll dethatch, I'll core aerate, I'll put down the top dressing of compost, and then I'll overseed the lawn and then follow the directions on the seed bag for watering, and off it goes. So if you're to do that in the fall, off you go. Your lawn's going to be awesome. That little bit of compost with some dethatching and aeration. And then, in the future, just raising your mower deck, you never have to use any chemicals, and you can get the best lawn on the block. And then compost in a potting mix. You can definitely use that. Some people screen it. Some people like a chunkier compost to create a fluffier mix in their potting mix. I wouldn't do more than half by volume. I'd mix that with, there's different recipes online using rice hulls, coconut coir, peat moss, perlite, vermiculite, things like that. But you can definitely create your own potting mix if you like. Compost happens. All right, let's keep that all in mind as we're going. And then this is the shout out to where I ripped the slides off from, so that people get their due credit. So that's the end of the first section there. I just talked an unbelievable amount. So if people have questions, I'm happy to kick back and answer them before we try another section out.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, we do have some questions that have come in. So the first one is pretty early on. So we've got one guest who is having problems with white mold inside their worm compost bin, and it's never been a problem before. How can they prevent that? They have removed all the contaminated material each time, and it occurs within 3 days of adding new food and shredded paper.
White, it's just on the surface. If they want to hit me up, I can take a look at it with them. I guess a picture would help a lot. Typically, a lot of the issues with worm bins come from, in that case, like overfeeding. So I would try to just add small amounts of food so that the worms are kind of waiting for it and getting on top of it. Sometimes mold and other bugs will appear when there's more food than the worms can devour. So the quickest answer would be just slowly adding in food so the worms are chomping at the bit, kind of ramp them up to a higher intake on food sources. But the person with that question, if you want to send me a picture, I can also take a look. And if I can't answer it, I can get you in touch with Rhonda Sherman, who's the worm expert at North Carolina's extension. And she literally wrote the book on worm composting. So if I can't answer it, I'll get Rhonda to help us out.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you. Okay, the next question is, how do you make compost tea? And is this a way to accelerate the use of residential compost?
So compost tea, once again, the beauty of YouTube, there's all kinds of different ways to make it. Some people have really large rigs. Some people use aquarium bubblers and things like that. Some people do static compost teas or anaerobic compost teas. That kind of anaerobic stuff dates back to like medieval times. But kind of the best way to do it in a home system, and there's a lot of examples on YouTube, is taking a 5-gallon bucket of water. If you're on well water, you should be good to go. If you're on city water, then I would let it sit for 24 hours to let any of the chlorine and things like that dissipate. But then what you would do is take either some compost from your garden or some compost you like or some worm castings. And for a 5-gallon bucket, I'd take about a quart of material and I'd put it into a sock or put it into an old piece of t-shirt or burlap. And what you want to do is just toss that into the 5-gallon bucket, turn on your little aquarium bubbler for maybe a day or two. And what that'll do is provide air to the water, and all the microbes in that worm castings or compost will kind of have the air available to them to multiply. And so after 24 or 48 hours of letting that kind of bubble and brew, you could take that liquid and apply it. And if it's a compost that has been through like the heat phase, like I talked about, a commercial compost, you could actually do foliar applications where you can actually spray it directly on the plant. Or if you're using your home compost or any other compost, you can also just do, watering around the roots as you go. And so typically what we tell people is if you want to do that, you could do that as often as every 2 weeks during the growing season. And if you do that kind of 1 quart to 5 gallons, you don't need to cut it or dilute it any further. It's fine. It's not going to burn your plants. And you could just water it the same amount as you would use water. So you could just sub it in your watering can maybe every 2 weeks. So that's the long story short. And like I said, there's also a lot of good things on the internet. You should be careful. There's a lot of anecdotal things on YouTube. They're not always backed up, by university research and things like that.
Excellent. That was great info. So the next 3 questions are kind of what can or cannot be included. So we had a question about grass clippings without herbicide applications, but I know you covered that and that was okay, right?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I would be wary of, things that have herbicides. I didn't really cover it, but there are some chemicals out there, mostly available at the commercial grade. There are some persistent herbicides that are concerning. So especially if you're going to use, grass clippings from a neighbor, making sure they're not using True Green or something like that. And then if you're going to get manure from a farm, also making sure that their hay field and things like that have not been treated with herbicides, because those can create issues.
Excellent. The next question is dog or cat hair. after brushing them?
I mean, you can. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, you definitely can. It wouldn't be something I would do, but you can. Yeah.
Sure. And then the next question is, can you add tomatoes that have blossom end rot?
Tomatoes that have blossomed. Oh, like tomatoes that have gone bad.
Yeah.
Right. So the only thing is if your compost is fertile and microbes are doing well, the good microbes, then the bad microbes might do well there as well. So yeah, those kinds of things I would destroy.
Makes sense. Okay, and then I did put the link in the chat to the composting website from Cornell that you mentioned, so everybody
Okay, great.
got there. Okay, do all veggie and fruit scraps attract critters the way protein scraps would?
No, I mean, I don't really have issues when I throw in my spoiled kale or my clippings from the garden. So no, I would say no. Just the things that, I mean, I really like steak, and I think the raccoons in my neighborhood do too. So, those are the things that can be problematic, can create flies issues and things like that. So no, I think most fruits and vegetables, you should be fine.
Makes sense. And someone asked if you could put in your sticks and random branches.
Sure, those create like good porosity. The only thing is on the other end when you're done, are you going to just let them ride or screen them out? So it just becomes on the using end of things. But on the starting part, it creates good porosity.
That makes sense. Okay, we've got a guest who has a round barrel compost bin that spins around. Does the spinning action done daily provide adequate aeration?
So it helps, but you still want to have that good brown and green mix. So having some stuff in there to create porosity helps, some handfuls of wood chips or leaves or things like that. But the turning does help.
Okay. Would it make sense to accumulate green residential waste for 6 months and mix them all at once with leaves in the fall?
That's always the trouble, right? All of our leaves are available at an inconvenient time for when we're trying to do our summer garden clean outs and flower trimming and all that. So it depends. I mean, if grass clippings or your old tomato plants are sitting in a pile, that's not going to necessarily create odor issues like if you're just, putting your bago salad and everything out there or whatever. So I guess it just depends on the material. That's where it's like, I think one of the slides talks about having space for storage. Some people stockpile leaves and then kind of measure them out throughout the year. So like I said, Mike McGrath is stealing all his neighbors' leaves all year to build up a stockpile. So it just depends you could stockpile the green material depending on what it is. So
that's a good point. Someone has finished compost that has plants growing in it. Is that a good sign or a sign that it needs more composting?
My best squash and pumpkin plants always come from the compost pile, right? The volunteers those are hardy plants. So yeah, it's like, once again, a good sign, right? Things are growing. So, if it's a plant you like, it's good. It's frustrating if you start to see like stilt grass or something come up, right? So yeah, generally it's a good sign.
Okay. At what point in the process is it assumed we have stopped adding new material, especially food scrap?
Right. That's like the challenge when we have tumblers and things like that. Like, how do we ever get this thing done if we're always adding it? So the 3-bin system is nice for that, or having 2 compost bins if you have the space and the means to make that happen. I would generally let it go a couple of weeks or months. Once again, if you dig into the material and you no longer see the food waste, we can assume it's some level of done. And compost doesn't necessarily have to be completely done depending on the application. If we were doing a potting mix, we want something that's really mature and stable. If you're going to take your compost and just mix it in the fall with your garden soil and let it overwinter, it doesn't have to be that far done. It could be still kind of breaking down, and once it gets in the soil, it'll complete the process. So I guess it just depends too on what your application is. Some things like a seed starting mix or a potting mix, you got to have stone cold compost. When you're mixing stuff into the soil, it's pretty tolerant.
Sure. Excellent. We had a question about restrictions for shredded paper. So whether or not you can include colored paper, and if the tubes from toilet paper and paper towels are okay.
By the way, say hi to Mark for me. So let's see this Mark's smile. That's funny. I've been out to see his digester. Very cool. So yeah, the shredded paper, like when it comes to that, like most newspaper In this area, it's all soy-based inks. Like I don't use like Parade magazine or the Target insert because that's a little glossy, but I'll use my Washington Post or Baltimore Sun. And then on the mail, I'd say most things are fine. What do you have to watch out for when you're shredding your paper? The compost bin's a good place for it because most curbside recycling doesn't take shredded paper. So it's a good idea to compost them. It's those little plastic envelopes that come in your mail. When you shred that, then you end up with all those micro pieces of plastic. So just maybe be a little bit more mindful about what you're shredding. If you're shredding that whole, Publishers Clearinghouse envelope with the plastic, then that's going to be a problem that's going to reappear in the garden. But most colored stuff, most adhesives, they're all relatively safe. They're not what they were 10 or 20 years ago. Okay.
And then the paper towel rolls and toilet paper rolls, those are okay?
Yeah. So all my paper towels from my kitchen, I put all those in the, unless I use like a cleaning thing on it, but I have a 1 and a 2-year-old. So we go through a lot of paper towels in the house, cleaning up messes and in the kitchen. So like all that short paper fiber that you can't recycle paper towels and toilet paper and tissues. I compost all that stuff as long as it's not icky because it's great for the compost pile.
Makes sense. Okay. We have someone asking about the invasive jumping worms, that they like leaf litter areas. Is this a concern for the home compost bin?
I don't know about that. I'll have to research and get back to you. I don't know about the jumping worms, but I can find out. I'll put a note. Okay.
When is the best time to add compost to the garden, whether it's a raised bed or not? Fall, winter, spring, or summer?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, obviously it depends on in between your crop rotations. Like right now, if you're phasing out summer stuff at some point and getting into your fall stuff, it's nice opportunity. If you're going to be putting in your storage stuff later in the summer, if you're going to do it in the spring anyway, and you can put it in the fall or the winter, then it can sit there all winter and it can get all that moisture and it can hang out and it can further mature. So if you have the choice between winter or spring, winter is a great time to do it because it can just sit there and soak up moisture and mature in place. And then you're ready to go when you're ready to put your seeds in.
That's a great idea. And then I think the last one for now, one more came in. Okay. Is there a temperature of the compost one can know that you have a good compost is ready?
Yeah. I mean, if you had like a hot pile and it's time to go use it, like once again, even if you had sometimes our compost, like we were making topsoil the other day or garden soil and we had compost that was 120 degrees. And as soon as we mixed it with soil to make the garden soil, it was immediately the ambient temperature. So a lot of times, even if you have, depending, once again, it comes back to what's your application. If you're just adding it to the garden, even if it's still a little warm, that soil is number one going to help break it down and finish, and the temperature will quickly drop. So if you're doing a potting mix or something like that, then you want to make sure it's not hotter than the temperature you need your seeds to be at.
Okay. And then our actual last one, a neighbor has 5 mature oak trees and they've offered their fall leaves for compost. How concerned should they be with the 2 dogs' waste in only a 1/3 acre area?
Oh man, I don't know. Is there no one does the dogs ever, or just there might be a couple? I guess it depends on the I don't know, the level of poop that's mixed in there. Yeah, I mean, like you'll see things about like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation trying to get people to pick up after their dogs because of the pathogens getting into our waterways. Yep. So if there's a little bit in there, I think it'd be fine. If like they just let the dogs run and never pick it up, then I'd probably be a pass on those leaves.
Should compost bin be placed in full sun or partial shade?
So like if you can do partial shade, it's probably good because like on hot days, you're going to have more evaporation. So if you can do partial shade, that's nice. Sometimes people want to see kind of how things work. So I'll just talk a little bit about how we do composting. And how I got into this, because a lot of people wonder how I ended up doing compost for a living. So just what we'll cover, my quick personal background, the company, how our compost process works, and then the products we make, and kind of talk about some of the people that we work with. Some people might be obvious, and some people you might not realize are doing composting, food scrap composting. So, like I said, I grew up in Columbia near the mall. Probably the last person anybody in high school would have thought was going to join the Army, but I did. So I did ROTC. So the day I graduated college, I also raised my right hand and was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Army. So I was a combat engineer officer. I went to school for computers. I was an engineer in the Army, and then now I do composting. So well-rounded or disjointed life just depends on how you tell the story. So the great thing about the Army is these days a lot of overseas travel. So I did a year in Korea. I went to Kuwait, and then I spent my last thing on active duty was 15 months in Iraq. So I don't really have any pictures of me doing like regular Army stuff. We weren't really taking pictures when we were doing that. All the pictures I have are me being an idiot. So like in this example, me in the Kuwaiti desert with some of the King's camels happening through. So we had 5 years active duty, 5 years in the Guard. I got out of Mosul on active duty, and I joined the National Guard, and I came home, and it was in 2009 and right in the middle of the Great Recession. So probably bad timing on my part. So I found myself unemployed. And you can be angry and sad for only so long, and then it's time to do something. And so I started to look at different sustainable businesses. And when I looked at different sustainable businesses like solar energy and things like that, there was a lot of capital and training involved. And I looked at recycling and bottles and cans and scrapping metal, a lot of people doing that. And then I looked at electronics waste like cell phones and computers, and that's only 1% to 3% of the waste pie. But when you look at a pie chart of waste in America, 2/3 of what's in every trash truck in this country is compostable. It's food waste, yard waste, untreated wood waste, paper waste. So 2/3 of every trash truck you drive by today or tomorrow, what's in the back could be composted. And when I started, there were only 2 other people doing this in the state of Maryland, 2 other companies. So imagine going to the Olympics and you get in the starting blocks and you immediately get a bronze medal because you're just only the 3rd person running the race. So that was pretty sweet. So what happened is I built my first compost pile in July of 2010. Shortly after I started, the other 2 guys went out of business. And so we, for most of the last 10 years, have been the only compost operation going in the state of Maryland for commercial composting of food scraps. So we have a site in Aberdeen, which is our main facility, and that's open on weekdays if you ever want to come see what we're doing. And then we have a smaller site in Fairfax, Virginia, and a 3rd facility we're trying to build in Lothian, Maryland. We're going on like 6 years of trying to get going in Anne Arundel County, but someday it'll get going and we'll get through all the permitting of that. I started out with just me as an employee. Now we have 20 folks working for us day to day. And the main business, like I said, is we collect and compost food scraps. So people's homes, people's offices, people's, restaurants, supermarkets, things like that, all kinds of different residential and commercial customers. And then we make all kinds of different products out of that. So bulk and bag compost, we do worm castings, we do different soil mixes and things like that. So our main facility, we have a 30-acre farm that we lease in Aberdeen. We're like right on the edge of town. If we were to zoom out from this picture, you would see that we're walking distance from the Rita's water ice. So we're very close to town. We have neighbors on 3 sides, and the 4th side is I-95. So we use about 3 acres of the 30 acres for the composting, and the rest of it is just farm fields and forest and things like that. We use what's called positive ASP or positive aerated static piles. I have a diagram later that I can kind of better explain that. But essentially what we're doing is we're putting air into the pile. Like we talked about, the most important things, air being the first thing. We're forcing air into the pile so that we don't have to turn it or touch it during the time that it's actively composting. And this system is the same thing if you've ever go to Western Branch at PG County, or you go to Alpha Ridge for Howard County. Those are both municipal facilities that use the same technology. The only difference is that they have millions of dollars of taxpayer money, and we do not. So our system is made with parts that we've gotten on Amazon and Home Depot and stuff like that, and their stuff is a little bit more higher end. We do large scale worm casting production. and we have 11 employees at the site. So our second facility is in Fairfax, on a 200-acre farm. Unfortunately, we were evicted in the middle of COVID, when supposedly you're not supposed to be able to evict people. So we're actually moving this week to a farm in Alexandria, Virginia. So our new digs are pretty cool. If you ever heard of Arcadia, we're side by side with our friends at Arcadia, which is a cool farm that helps supply produce to inner city, DC, and other areas. Our Virginia DC operation, we have 13 employees there. It's a lot smaller. So we make about 600 cubic yards a year, because that's all that our permit allows in Virginia. And all of that material is used at the farm where we produce it. So one of the benefits to our friends at Arcadia is they're now going to be compost rich. So they're going to have a lot of compost to use for all their vegetable production and things like that. And so most of the material that goes there is from residential and office collection in the DC metro area. So how's our business work? We're actually we strive to be a for-profit business. It can be challenging at times, but we have a collection service. So day to day, on weekdays, we have trucks and vans that are out collecting from people's homes and offices and businesses, where we do a 1-for-1 swap. So we drop off a bin at someone's house or someone's supermarket, and we pick up clean bins. We leave clean bins and take away the dirty bins, and they get dumped out and washed at our facility. We have material drop off. So we have some customers who bring material to us, tractor trailer loads or dumpster loads of material from greenhouses, supermarkets, things like that. We also do special events. Obviously, we're not doing any of that this year. Probably the largest event we do is the Rotary Crab Feast in Annapolis, which is a couple thousand people at the Navy Stadium cracking crabs. It's supposedly the largest crab feast in the world. And we actually fill 2 30-yard roll-off dumpsters. So 2 of the large roll-off dumpsters we fill with all the crab waste, the corn cobs, the paper from the table, all the beer cups, the crab soup cups. Everything at the event is compostable, except even the mallets end up in the mix. And all that's brought up for us to compost. So special events are kind of on hold. We do our product sales, and we do some consulting. So at the commercial scale, I guess what I just want to show is the difference between the residential, where there's some things maybe we wouldn't do, like we wouldn't do meat and bones and fish and things like that, but we can do them at the larger scale. We also do a lot of compostable wares, things that are certified compostable. So as you start to see more takeout spoons and cups and to-go containers that are compostable, we accept all those different materials if they're certified compostable. The things that we're always trying to avoid ending up in there is the trash, the glass, the plastic, things like that are not compostable and can't be broken down. So one example here I'll show is, this is GBMC. So if you're ever in the Towson area and you get hurt, GBMC is a great option. We also do St. Joseph. That's a nice hospital too. They're right next door to each other. But this is GBMC's kitchen. They have 2 bins in the kitchen. So this is at the pot sink. So as they're cleaning all the pots and they have all their prep waste, everything goes in the bin. They also have another bin over at the tray line. So all the trays that come back from the patient rooms or the lunch room, all that material gets dumped into the bins as well to be composted. So as you can see, it's an interesting mix of all kinds of different things. Basil, you can see in there, some other material. They do room service there, so you can order whatever you want. You're not just stuck eating Salisbury steak because it's Salisbury steak day. So it is a nice place to dine if you're injured. All of our bins are out on the loading dock. So they get clean bins as they need them and bring them in the kitchen, and then park the bins that have food waste here. Great thing is here, we were looking for a place on the dock to put the bins. And at loading docks at a lot of commercial facilities, real estate can be really hard to come by. But in this case, this was available because no one else wanted this area. We're right above the morgue. And so nobody else wanted to hang out there. So we had our choice of places to put the bins there, and no one bothers them. Our trucks show up, the guys slide off clean bins and load up the dirty bins. They come back to our facility. We have a concrete area where we dump out the material. So we talked about moisture being another part that's really important. So we lay down a bed of wood chips from tree companies, and we dump out all of our food waste, so that on any moisture, any liquid that comes out, especially this time of year with, you can see watermelon and things like that, pineapples, things that have a lot of moisture, those wood chips are gonna capture all of that liquid. And then we'll mix more wood chips on top to mix that out. So the guys will dump the bins out, pick out any trash, and then we'll mix it all together. So we use the loaders to mix everything, so we get that 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 mix that we talked about. And then our piles are the set it and forget it method. So the pile at the bottom left hand of the screen there, you can see kind of the white stuff on top, some paper plates and things like that. That's our active pile. And so that pile has pipes that are inserted in it. So this is an example of kind of the breakout diagram. This shows 2 different examples. On the left, where it says suction, that's a negative pile where the blower would be sucking air in. Sometimes you see that at water treatment plants where they're worried about odors. So for example, here in the city of Aberdeen, they use negative aeration for their compost operation, but there are some challenges with that. So we use positive aeration. So the pile to the right where it says pressure, we force air into the pipe, and then the air blows through the pile and eventually out the tops and sides. And so by inserting these perforated pipes, we have hooked them up to a blower. In our case, we use the same blowers that you use for large moon bounces or those inflatable movie screens. That's what we use, and we hook them up to timers. And so when we take our pile temperatures, we can see how hot the pile is, and we can adjust how often and how long the blower comes on to supply the right amount of air. So once we get that mix, like you saw with the loader, and we build the pile, we don't touch that for 30 days. So we have to make sure that we have our mix of browns and greens correct and our moisture correct, because we're not going to come back and turn that again until it's done the active phase. So we got to make sure it has the right amount of moisture and the right amount of porosity, and then we set the blowers and off it goes. So within 72 hours, our pile goes from, showing up here and getting dumped out to where it's at about 135 to 145 degrees, and then everything's quickly breaking down. So after 30 days of this aeration system, you can no longer see any of the food waste. If you dig in where there was a fish, the bones, everything is gone. Really, the only remnants of food that are left are very large bones, so like ham hocks or very large bones, and then some shells. Oysters and clams will kind of hang around. Things like mussels and crab shells, those will either disintegrate or they'll break into very small pieces because of the temperature. So we screen everything. This green machine is a screener that separates all the larger particles from the finer particles. So we screen to a 1/2 inch so that what you get is a little bit finer. And all the larger pieces, the bigger wood chips, the clam shells, the oyster shells, they're going to come out the other end, and we'll put them back through the compost pile and keep breaking them down until they're fine enough to pass through the screen. So we take that compost and we have our compost, and then we make all kinds of different things. And you can do the same thing with the compost from your yard, making a garden soil. We do worm castings. You can take your compost from your yard and make raised bed mix, like the Mel's mix. So the compost, the coarse vermiculite, and the peat moss. And we've even gotten into now making biochar and super soils. So we're kind of targeting some of the higher end stuff that the cannabis growers are looking for. Not my thing. I'm more of a Natty Boh guy, but for years and years, people have been buying our products to make their own mixes for that industry. So we figured, it was about time for us to sell some pickaxes to those gold miners. So that's kind of the business we're getting into is marketing some soils to that industry. So some notable customers that we collect from, like I said, people maybe you didn't think of. If you go to a Ravens game, we pick up the food scraps from all their catered events, their luxury boxes. And then they have their on-site staff, when they're operational, where they have about 60 to 80 people on site pre-COVID. That the electricians, the plumbers, the ticket sales and marketing people that eat in the lunchroom. So there's actually material there produced every day. We do work with McCormick Spice Company. City of Havre de Grace is a cool one where if you're in Hartford County or in Havre de Grace, they have a drop-off program. So they have bins down by the farmer's market where you can come by and drop off your food scraps. It's free to use. And then we go and service the bins. And so that way, now they've gone from 0 to a couple hundreds. And I think now we're up to like over 1,000 pounds a week of food scraps. So people stop by to go to the farmer's market. We're just passing through that part of town during the week and drop off their food scraps. And so that kind of drop off model is a cool way to, get a toe in the water for capturing food scraps in a municipal environment. So So there we go. So that's kind of what it looks like for us. If you were to thinking about starting a compost company, there's the playbook. You can just copy what we did there.
That was awesome. It was really fascinating to see how you guys got that started, and it's just such a smart business model. I love it. And so we did have a couple questions that came in
Sure.
About your program. So did you mention wind energy? Because someone wants to know how that's done.
Yeah, we buy wind energy from like our electricity provider. So if we own the property, I do full-time solar, but we just buy wind RECs from Washington Gas.
Excellent. And what does it mean to be commercially compostable?
So I guess that's one of the things that pop up. Like if you see a spoon that says certified compostable, some things that are out there can break down in your backyard pile, and some things need to be in what they call like an industrial compost facility, because you got to have that hot temperature to break down the corn resins and things like that. Mm-hmm. So in our case, we can take anything in the backyard. It can be a challenge. Like everyone hated that sun chip bag back in the day that was compostable. So some things you're going to have trouble with in your backyard, but we can take anything that says compostable because of our pile temperatures.
Excellent. And what about the city of Baltimore? Are they willing to set up your compost bins?
Tell them to call me. I'd love to. They have a compost initiative, but for some reason, they don't call us. So yeah, we'd love to work with them. And I think we do it in Falls Church, Virginia as well. And that was like the first one in the area. And now like city of Fairfax is doing it. And we have some other folks that are city of Gaithersburg, some other people. It's a great way to like, if a town's not ready to do curbside collection because of the expense and the trouble, it's a good way to do it. And the folks and get people just thinking about it. So it's in Havre de Grace, we've gone from 0 to like, now they probably need more bins. We're filling all the bins and it's only been a month. So it's really been cool to see it just kind of take off.
That's awesome. And someone asked for a list of cities that do participate.
Like I said, Gaithersburg works with somebody else and Fairfax works with somebody else. And we work with Falls Church and Havre de Grace. And I think that's the only ones that I can think of off the top of my head.
Sure.
But it's pretty cheap for the cities. It's pretty inexpensive. We don't make a ton off of it. We kind of think it's worth just getting people rolling with it.
That's awesome. If you don't turn your home pile, does it just take longer?
Yeah, it'll just take longer. Might take a year, but it'll still break down.
Okay. Have you found anything that doesn't compost?
Like I said, large bones are sometimes, it's interesting. Like you'll see like in the fall, we get like let's say a ham hock or something like that, or a large piece of bone, and you'll see it. And then you walk up and touch it with your hands and it'll just turn into powder in your hands. So it'll quickly break down. Yeah. So, the toughest thing that we've had to compost is we were doing gum, and that was a challenge. It was too high in, I think, sugars. It was too high in nitrogen.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay. Makes sense.
Don't compost powdered gum.
Can the worm castings be used as a mulch for my flower beds in the fall?
They're a little bit more expensive than regular compost. So like what you could do is just kind of sprinkle them around. So like worm castings at like 5 to 15% of a mixture have the same efficacy as 100%. I mean, if I was like a good salesman, I'd tell you, yeah, you should go an inch deep, but like you could sprinkle it in and you would still have really good results. So I would say like you could kind of broadcast it around the garden, and that would be a good way to do it.
Great. If folks are including paper towels in the compost bin, can they have any oils on it? Like if you've wiped off a pan?
I think a little moderation in life is good, right? There's no middle ground anymore in 2020, right? It's left or right or whatever, or mask or no mask. But yeah, if there's a little oil, we'll be all right.
Excellent. Okay, so that's all we have for now. We've got about 30 minutes left, so we have one more section to go through.
Worm composting is kind of cool. It's a great thing to do right now if you have kids during COVID that you're trying to keep occupied. If you have a tight space where a compost bin maybe doesn't work, or you just want to have something else to supplement your garden, because it doesn't take much to supply the worms. So if you want to have a compost bin and a worm bin, you can totally do that. So the Y compost will motor through, because we've already covered that in another deck. Let's talk about the basics of worms, some interesting facts. And then, like I said, the link is in there about building the bin. The bin, you can buy worm factories or can of worms. They're a couple, maybe like 100 or 150 bucks online. Another great thing to look for if you're trying to do it on the cheap, look on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, because when people move, they typically don't bring their worm bins with them. So sometimes you can get them on the secondary market. And then the bin that I include the video link for uses 2 Rubbermaid totes. So like your price for building the bin is probably like $12. So it's a pretty inexpensive, bin that you could build if you just want to have something simple. So there's more things about how we should all compost. So there's the great things about worm castings are that they're an awesome soil amendment. Generally, it's even better than compost. We'll talk about that in a second. And the worms are really easy to take care of, and you can do them just about anywhere. So there are hundreds of different kinds of species of worms. There's typically about a dozen that people use for composting. And there's 3 that really you've probably may or may not have heard of. There's European night crawlers, African night crawlers, and red wigglers. I'm a big fan of red wigglers. I haven't done the night crawlers. I've had people tell me that they are a little problematic. They get out and wander out of their bins often. So that was enough for me. No thanks. So I'm not a huge bug person, but I can do a few. And so I really like red wigglers, and that's what we'll talk about. Sometimes people call them around here like manure worms or something like that. But these are kind of the 2 different kinds of worms. If you think about like in your garden, you may see like those big gray worms. Those are like the loner worms. They're like the Ted Kaczynski worm. They like live by themselves. They go deep down in the ground. They really want to be in the soil and kind of do their thing. And they do a great job there of helping aerate, our ground. Red wigglers are more of like your like fraternity worm. They're like your person's, having the COVID parties. They all like to be close to each other. They like to live near the surface. They're voracious eaters. They reproduce a lot. They never sleep. So, that's kind of why they make a really great compost worm, and they stay put. So like those big gray worms, if you were to put them in a compost bin, they'd probably take off on you, versus the red wigglers are going to stay where you put them. As long as they have a food source, they're going to be happy where they're at. Interesting facts about them. They never sleep. Ideally, they can double their population every 90 days if you had everything right with food source, temperature, moisture, things like that. So, maybe, stock market being what it is and fixed income assets, maybe it's time to buy your kids some worms, and then think of the exponential growth. If they start with 1 pound now, they could, have thousands of pounds and sell them online and have a huge income in the future. So maybe worms are the way to go for investing. So there's all kinds of things online about worms eating their body weight, 24 hours, 48 hours. I'd say like 3 to 4 days is probably a safer bet. And that depends on like what the food source is, what the temperature is. But like a pound of worms could eat a pound of food scraps. And I would say a safe estimate would be like 3 to 4 days. So it's pretty dramatic. It might not be all the food scraps in your house, but it's a decent amount if you like it to be. So they are light phobic. So red wigglers do not like light, and kind of use that to our advantage. When you're starting a worm bin, what I do is I leave the lid off, and I put them in like my half bath of my house with the light on all night. And that light kind of trains them to stay put. If you were to just dump your worms when you get them into the bin and put the lid on and come back the next day, you may notice that some of them have started to break out because they don't know their boundaries. They haven't been trained yet to stay put. So because worms are light phobic, if you're ever worried about them getting out, you just sleep with the lights on. So that's what I usually do is that first day, like I said, if I add worms to my worm bin, I make sure there's enough bedding for them to go down into, and then I just leave the light on overnight so they kind of get comfortable and situated in their new home. So their ideal temperature is 77 Fahrenheit. I mean, we don't have to be totally dialed in on that, but understand that if they were outside on a day like today in direct sunlight in your garden, they would be no more. So into the low 90s is about as hot as they want to get, kind of like us. And I would say that they're generally good till down to almost freezing. But remember that worms are made out of almost all water. So if they get down to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you no longer have worms, you have popsicles. So when it does get cooler and it does drop into, say, the 40s or 50s, they're kind of like fish in a pond in the winter. They're still there. They're just not very active. They'll just kind of hang out and they'll wait for the temperature to rise. And when you get up into like that 70s and so then you see really active worms, because the soil temperature or the material temperature kind of helps them be at a spot where they're really active and moving and things like that. So temperature is important to know the limits at the low and the high to keep them alive. And then if you can hit that sweet spot of 50 to 85, then you're going to have a lot of activity. When they're active, that means they're reproducing. That means they're pooping out worm castings and they're devouring our organic waste. So worms need moisture since they're almost entirely water. So where we talked about our compost bin being, say, 40 to 60% moisture content in our compost bin, we want our worm bin to be like 80% moisture. So you'd want to reach in and grab a handful and squeeze it and have like water drip out of your hand. You don't want it to be totally saturated, because if it was totally just water soaked, the worms there'll be no air. The water will replace the air throughout the material and the worms will suffocate. They'll have no air to breathe. So you don't want it to be just waterlogged, but you want it to be very, very moist. And you'll see that in your worms. Material, as it starts to dry out, the worms get a little bit thinner. They start to look a little more scraggly. And as the moisture content of the material comes up, you'll notice your worms are a little bit more plump. They have a little bit more, mass to them. So worms need grit to digest. We'll look at some pictures of worm anatomy if you care to in a minute, but worms don't have teeth. So they use a gizzard and enzymes and bacteria to break things down. So they need a little bit of grit to have that ability to make that gizzard work. So people will sometimes sprinkle a handful of old compost or garden soil in their bin, and that provides enough. That'll be fine just as it is. So they don't have teeth. So it's a lot easier for the worms if you are to break up an apple versus putting a whole apple in the bin, helping out some worms that don't have teeth. So the more surface area and the more you can break things up, the easier it'll be for them and the faster they'll break things down. Some people go to the point where they have like an old blender and they'll actually blend up their food scraps and create like a worm slurry and then put that in their worm bin. Like if you want to go to that level, that's awesome. I'm not there, but hey, that's not to say, you can't get there. And that could be something you could do if you like. Red wigglers have 5 hearts. I don't know. That probably get you win you a cup of coffee sometime in a trivia contest. And when you cut worms in half, it doesn't create 2 worms. It creates 0 worms. So when you cut them in half, it just kills them. So that's not doubling your worms. It's murder in the eyes of the state there. So let's not do that. So worm anatomy, we don't have to get too into this. Like I said, it's just kind of interesting to know that they don't have teeth. And, if you want to see all the breakdown, it's in the slides. Further cross-sectional, if you're into that. This is a great thing, you can, of how worms are made. So worms are hermaphrodites. They're boys and girls. So if you're going to name all your worms, you got to come up with some, androgynous names now. So you need, I don't know, Pat, Chris, things like that. You got to start really thinking of your names. So everybody likes everybody in the worm bin. And when they reproduce, they produce cocoons, and the average cocoon has anywhere from 1 to 3 worms in it. And you're probably like, well, what does a worm cocoon look like? So that little yellow thing there almost looks like a little like quartz pebble. That's a worm cocoon. So sometimes you might even see that in your garden or something like that. You may see that in some leaf litter. And that dime is there to kind of provide an idea of scale. So it's kind of cool how the worms reproduce. So what can we feed them? So they love vegetable waste and fruit waste. I think there's a micro dirty jobs where they put bread on top of some worm bins at a place he's at, and the worms just love white bread, just like kids. So they pretty much have the appetite of kids. They love cantaloupe and watermelon rinds this time of year and things that are high in sugar, strawberries, things like that. You can do some paper. So it's a great use for shredded newspaper, where we talked about paper from our paper shredder earlier. They love that kind of cellulose material, and that's a great way to kind of be our our brown here, to help. If it gets too moist, we can add in things like newspaper and shredded paper to help dry it out. Coffee grounds and filters. There's some, we don't sell worms now. We used to sell worms, and there were some offices that used to buy worms and have a worm bin in the office, and all they fed them was coffee grounds. So, I mean, there were probably some really jumpy, excited, energetic worms, but they did love that material. And the filters is that nice paper that breaks down pretty quickly. Tea bags, just know that, if your tea bags are synthetic or paper, like a lot of commercial tea bags now are actually made from like polypropylene. So the worms aren't gonna be able to break that down. But if you want to open them up and dump them out, that's great. Or if they're paper tea bags, they should be fine. All you'll see at the end, hopefully, is maybe a little piece of thread and a staple. We talked about paper towels earlier. This is another opportunity. If you have your paper waste, they could also potentially go in the worm bin as a carbon source. Just make sure they don't have any crazy dyes. Like I buy, once again, it's however you want to decorate your house. I just buy plain paper towels for my house. If you're going to get the all the dyed stuff, you might want to just double check what's in those dyes. And then finally, eggshells. They won't be able to break down the eggshells, but for whatever reason, like we find them tucked into pieces of eggshell and oysters and clamshells. They love little tight, hard areas to like kind of cozy up. So they'll clean them out, but they obviously won't be able to smash up the eggshells for you. So what don't we want to give them? This is pretty much like the same list we saw earlier for the backyard. Meat and dairy. They'll break those things down, but odds are that'll create more issues with pests. So you'll start to, might attract flies or ants or odors and things like that. The pet waste, no thanks. Large amounts of grass or animal manure. The issue there is sometimes if you add that in, it'll get hot, because there's a lot of nitrogen in it, and it'll cook your worms. So if you're going to add stuff in, just make sure you offset it with some newspaper or some paper so that you don't accidentally, cook your worms because the material you put in there got hot. So if you were to fill up a whole worm bin with grass clippings and the temperature spiked, it might have some wormicide. And the tough thing with worms is that when it's not like keeping chickens. Like if your chickens start dying and you look out in your yard and you see chickens everywhere, oh my gosh, we got a problem. We need to solve this. If you have worms, they just kind of disappear, right? Because they're mostly water. So as they die, they just kind of turn into nothing. So the first couple of weeks I ever had worms, I felt like I was like an overprotective helicopter dad where I'm checking the bin all the time. I'm like, hey, are there as many as there used to be? Am I losing some? Where am I at? So just know that if you are having issues, it may not be immediately, noticeable because they just kind of disappear. But also know that they're pretty hardy, so they are going to survive a lot of abuse. And then finally, a large amounts of citrus or onion. People will say no citrus or onion. Come back to that whole idea of there being a middle ground in life. I think a little bit's fine. If you're going to just go nothing but lemon juicer into the bin, they're probably not going to love that. But if there's a little bit of citrus or onion material, I think they'll be okay. So where to keep them? Outdoors. If you have an area outdoors that's shady, even this time of year, as long as it has shade, and they can stay out of direct sunlight where they're not going to get too hot and they're not going to get too dry, I think you're fine. Just make sure that, you don't have any pests that are going to want to bother with them. And then you got to have a plan for the winter. So whether it's bringing them into a closet inside or a garage or a basement or something like that, I wouldn't keep them outside through a Maryland winter unless they're really well insulated. So unless you're going to add a lot of material to the bins. So like here at our farm, our bins, when we get close to like November, we'll put about like, we'll add a lot of material to the bins and the worms will just kind of go to the middle and ride it out. So, if you want to leave it outside all year, depending on your bin design, if you can add a lot of material so they can self-insulate, then maybe they are okay outside. And then indoors, you can keep them in any room. So like when I used to live in the farmhouse here in Aberdeen, I lived here for a number of years. I used to keep the worms in the guest bedroom and I didn't tell anybody. So it was just like a nondescript Rubbermaid bin. And then the next morning it was like, oh, how was your sleep? Oh, cool. Hey, how'd you like sleeping with 3,000 worms? How was that? And, people are like horrified. What are you talking about? Oh, did you notice that worm bin in the corner of the room? So once again, a lot of the jokes I have in life are, for my own entertainment. So a lot of people don't stay at the farm twice, but I thought it was fine. You can keep them most places. Just kind of like, keep in mind, like, you don't want to have anywhere it's gonna be too hot or too cold, and then be mindful of who else lives in the house with you. You might think it's awesome to keep it in the guest bedroom, but maybe your spouse or children or roommate or whoever does not love that plan. So the idea of, well, when do we harvest it or when do we get our worm castings is kind of similar to that. When is our compost done? So harvest in the bin, there's a couple different ways to do that. The whole thing is, once again, like if it doesn't look like what we started with, then we're probably on the right track. If you have like the Worm Factory or the Can of Worms, one of those stackable tray bins, those are really nice because like we talked about, worms will consistently go to the surface and towards the food source. So if you have one of those tray systems, when you add a new tray of food, ideally the worms will leave the old material and go up to the new stuff, and you could take away that old tray and dump it out and have very few worms remaining. So those tray systems are really nice for that. If you decide to just do it in a Tupperware bin or build something a little bit more lower tech, we do have a couple options. The first is what I usually use is like the cone method. So on a day like today where it's really sunny, maybe I put out a piece of plastic or tarp or do this on the sidewalk. I'll dump out my bin and I'll put all the material in like a cone, and I'll scrape away the outside slowly. And as I scrape away the outside, all that casting material, the worms will sense the sunlight and they'll dive down deeper into the cone. And so as I work my way around and kind of scrape and scrape and scrape, I'm getting handfuls of my castings I can throw in a bucket for the garden. And then finally you get to a point where the cone has gotten smaller and smaller, and the worms are left in maybe something softball sized that's a mix of mostly worms and a little bit of castings, and I'll scoop that up and put it back in my bin. So it's using that light phobia to your advantage for harvesting them. An easy option is to feed one side of the bin. So if you had like a Tupperware bin, maybe for a week or two, all the food goes on one side of the bin, and the other side, you don't put anything. And eventually the worms will say, well, I'm going where the food is, and they'll vacate, and you can come in and scoop out that side of the bin. And then after you scoop it out, put the food over there, and the worms will move over, and you can scoop out the second side of the bin. So once again, a way that if you don't love touching the worms and doing all that. And then the last option would be screening the material. So you could sift out the worm castings and separate the worms from the castings. So like a 1/4 inch screen or an 1/8 inch screen of like wire mesh. You can make a nice little like kind of shake screen, handheld screen with some materials from Home Depot for just a couple of dollars. You want to rebuild the bin. So, once again, don't forget to add some grit, a little handful of garden soil or compost, and then adding in some papery material for carbon. So like paper towels or shredded newspaper, shredded paper, and then adding back in the food waste as well. And then we just talk real quick about using castings. So you can use them indoors or outdoors. The great thing about castings is that, worms don't have teeth. We've covered that a couple times. So when they break things down in their gut, they have all this bacteria and these microbes and enzymes that they use to break things down to get to what they need to consume. And then when they excrete it or they poop, all of those microbes are in the worm poop. And that also triggers other material, other microbes to become active in the material. And so the big attraction on worm castings is that it just has a lot of microbial life to it, even more than regular compost. So it's just a great material for adding microbial diversity and life to where your plants are. So you can use them in indoor plants or outdoor plants. You can make compost tea, which we talked about a little bit. And I think someone put the link there for the extension on how to do compost tea. When you're repotting plants or you buy a bag of potting soil at the store, you can mix in, like I said, 5 to 10% worm castings is all you need. That small amount in the larger volume, you get the same benefit as 100% strength. So just adding that into your potting mixes or your seed starting mixes really helps your plants germinate faster and stronger and have some degree of protection from some pathogens that are out there. Worm bin maintenance. Someone had asked earlier about the mold. Underfeeding is better than overfeeding. So putting less material in the bin and then letting the worms catch up and kind of, beg you for more. A lot of times people will order the bin on Amazon and they'll order worms from Uncle Jim's, and that week while they're waiting, you're getting all your food scraps and you're putting them in the freezer or whatever, and you're saving them. And when the worm bin gets here, you're so excited, you dump all that food waste in there. and it's too much for the worms. They're just getting settled in and they're overwhelmed. And then we get odors and we get flies, or we get fuzzy stuff growing. And then maybe that person in your household that wasn't really big on this idea of worms being in the house says, oh, I told you so. I knew this was going to be smelly. I knew there were going to be flies. So underfeeding is better than overfeeding. Checking the moisture every few days. If the bin does get really, really wet, sometimes we'll get mites and things like that, little flies, little whatever. You can kind of leave the bin outside for a little bit on a day like today and kind of dry crust the top, and that'll help solve a lot of our issues too. You don't want to do it too long because you don't want to bake your worms, but just getting the top crust of the material sometimes dry helps to get rid of a lot of our pests as well. You can add more newspaper, shredded paper if it gets too wet. And you can also get a thermometer if you want to kind of keep an eye on how things are doing. So this link is a easy way to build a worm bin. It's 2 Tupperware bins, 2 18-gallon bins. You could probably get for about $12 at Target or Home Depot. And I've made these over the years. They work really well. We use this style bin here when we're trying to reproduce worms. So we put these bins in the root cellar of the farmhouse, and we take a pound of worms and let them multiply, and then we'll siphon some worms off and put them into our larger production bins. So it's kind of how we continue to grow worms for expanding production. So one weird fact of worms is when you're trying to figure out how many worms for a bin, a pound of worms can cover a square foot. So like how many worms to add to a bin or what they'll grow to is a factor of the surface area. It's not volume or depth, which is weird. Like probably how you would think of it. So like an 18-gallon Rubbermaid bin, you have about 3 square feet of surface area. So if you add 1 pound of worms, they will eventually grow to 3 pounds of worms, because that's what the surface area will let them comfortably grow to. And then they'll self-regulate. So they're kind of like a goldfish in the aquarium. They'll grow to the size of their tank. So don't worry about worms taking over your house. They'll self-regulate based on space and food supply. It's not like they're going to start to send out missionaries to explore elsewhere around the house. As we use that to our advantage, we'll put a pound of worms in a bin that's undersized and let them grow out to 3 pounds. And then we can harvest 2 pounds and restart it. So little known fact about how to size your bins if you're looking to build your own. And then there we go. So now that was me just trying to rush because I know we're getting close to our noon time for wrapping this up.
Perfect. That was great. Thank you. So we just had a couple questions. Also, I just wanted to say I was cracking up like half the time during
Okay.
the presentation. That was fantastic. Okay. How do you separate out the compost material from the worms after it's done?
Yeah. So like I said, the cone method I really like, where I'll build everything up into a cone and then I'll scrape away the outside just really slowly, like on a Saturday, if you want to have like an adult beverage in your hand and just take your time, it's a good thing to do, where just let the sunlight work and then they'll slowly dive in to where you're left with mostly worms. If you don't get all the worms and they go in your garden, they're going to be fine in this area. They'll find some dead leaves or things to munch on. These kind of worms are not going to attack your plants. They're not interested in your roots of your plants. They're interested in leaf matter and things like that.
Awesome. Okay. And then someone had a friend who fed pumpkin rinds to her worms and it killed them.
I'll have to look that up. Pumpkin rinds. That and jumping worms are on my list. Okay. I'll have to look that one up. I didn't know that.
Okay. Other than that, it's just a lot of really nice comments. Someone got your compost for their community garden and they really liked it. And then lots of thank yous and great informative presentations.
Cool.
So thank you so much for presenting.
Well, this is preaching to the choir, right? You guys, everyone I'm sure listening is into compost. So it's nice to have a fun audience. I like it.
Yeah, absolutely. That was great.